So, what is a sadistic inner critic in the narcissist? Here's a misconception about narcissism that they have a problem of too much self love, arrogance, vanity, grandiosity taken to the extreme, a person who thinks too highly of themselves and needs to be brought down to earth. That framing sounds right until you look at what actually is happening inside the person with narcissistic traits. The opposite is closer to the truth. The narcissist has so little self love that they constructed an entire fake self to manufacture the appearance of it. And underneath that constructed persona is a voice that never stops punishing them for being alive. That voice is what we are talking about today, the sadistic inner critic, the superego that does not guide or correct, it torments. And if you're someone with narcissistic traits who has ever wondered why approval never lands, why achievement feels hollow, why you cannot stop running, this episode is for you. This is episode 4 of Healing Narcissism. So let's go deeper. When Freud described the superego, what he meant was the internalized voices of parents and authority, the conscience, the part of you that says you should have done better, you let people down, you're not living up to your own values. For most people, that internal voice, while harsh at times, has a function. It helps you learn from mistakes. It helps you adjust your behavior. It is connected to actual standards you hold. The narcissist's inner critic does not work that way. Vaknin calls it the sadistic superego. This is not a critical inner voice. It's a self-generated torture mechanism. It emerged because the child's environment was so hostile, so rejecting of their actual self that only a godlike false self could survive the rejection. But the gap between the godlike self and the child's actual experience never closed. The critic uses that gap as its primary ammunition. Here's the part that most people miss. This critic is not really your parents, even though it sounds like them. It is not the teacher who humiliated you or the parents who withheld affection, even though those experiences shaped the ground it grew on or grew in. The sadistic superego is self-generated. It is a false self attacking the true self that never fully developed. Vaknin puts it this way: the narcissist is the narcissist's biggest victim. The abuse the narcissist enacts outward, they first perfected on themselves internally. Before they devalue anyone else, they have been devaluing themselves for as long as they can remember. The inner critic is the original wound. Everything else follows from it. Think about what that means for a moment. The narcissist's inner world is not a throne room where a grandiose king sits comfortably. It's a courtroom where the judge, the defendant, and the executioner are all the same person. The verdict was decided before the trial began. The sentence is always the same. You are not enough. You never were. And no amount of external evidence will change that verdict because the court operates on its own internal logic that has no connection to reality. The inner critic is so relentless because of the grandiosity gap. The false self presents as perfect, brilliant, superior, beyond criticism. That is the image. The reality is a person who is terrified of being seen, incapable of genuine intimacy, haunted by the suspicion that they are a fraud. The gap between the image and the lived experience is where the critic lives and works. Every moment the narcissist does not live up to the godlike standard, the critic fires. And the standard is impossible because it's not based on reality. It's based on a defensive fantasy. The critic demands perfection from a person who is by definition imperfect. So the critic punishes not for real failure, but for the ordinary human condition of being finite, having needs, making mistakes, and being visible. Shame in narcissism is structural rather than social. Most people feel shame when they do something that violates their actual values. The narcissist feels shame simply for being a person. for having a body, for being a finite, the ideal, their for being the ideal their false self promises they are. The gap itself is the shame, not what they did, but what they are. The grandiosity gap generates pervasive worthlessness, and worthlessness is not the same as low self-esteem. Low self-esteem can be corrected with evidence. You feel bad about a failure, someone points out the context. You adjust your self-assessment, you feel better. The process does not work the same for the narcissist because the evidence does not register. The critic has already decided the gap is the crime, and no amount of exculpatory evidence reaches the defendant because the judge is not interested in the facts. Vaclin points out that the narcissist's external grandiosity is inversely related to their internal self-hatred. The louder the claims of perfection and brilliance, the more active the critic inside. They're not confident, they are making noise to cover the sound of the voice that never stops. Every exaggeration is a defense. Every performance of superiority is a noise machine turned up against a signal that says you're nothing. Here's the part that people with narcissistic traits recognize immediately and everyone else finds hard to believe. External supply does not work, not permanently, not really. The narcissist needs validation, admiration, attention, and the reflected glory of others because the inner critic never stops. But when supply arrives, it silences the critic only temporarily. It cannot eliminate the critic because the critic generates its own momentum. Think of it this way. The inner critic runs a continuous loop of self-condemnation. External supply is like playing music to cover the sound. The music gets louder, the voice underneath adapts and recalibrates, and soon you need more music just to get back to baseline. The supply becomes a kind of addiction, not because it works, but because it briefly interrupts the unbearable internal state. The narcissist is not chasing admiration because it feels satisfying. They're chasing it because silence from the critic feels survivable, even if only for an hour. This is why a narcissist, can be surrounded by people who genuinely admire them and still feel empty. The supply goes in, but it does not land where it needs to. It cannot land because landing would require the true self to show up and receive it. And the true self has been locked behind the false self since childhood. What receives the supply is the performance. And the performance does not feel satisfied because it is not real. It's a machine designed to generate the appearance of satisfaction without any of the substance. It's a feedback loop with no exit. The critic generates anxiety. The anxiety drives the need for supply. The supply temporarily calms the critic. The calm feels like relief. The relief fades, and the critic resumes. The loop continues. There is no break in the pattern because the architecture of the false self depends on the critic to maintain the gap. Eliminate the critic, and the false self loses its job. The false self cannot allow that. When the inner critic activates, the narcissist has a limited repertoire of responses. They are a cascade. The first option is to perform grandiosity, close the gap with a burst of superiority, claim more, exaggerate further, attack whoever is nearby with evidence of their inadequacy. This is the loud, aggressive, outward narcissist that most people recognize, the person who, when challenged, immediately elevates themselves above the challenger. I'm better than you. I know more. I have accomplished more. Listen to me. The second option is retreat to fantasy. Go inside where the critic cannot follow because the fantasy is designed to match the false self exactly. In the fantasy, The critic has no ammunition because the fantasy itself, rather the fantasy self, is exactly as perfect as the critic demands. Nothing would wound you in the place that does not exist. This is why narcissists spend so much time in their own heads. Reality keeps failing them. But in the fantasy in the fantasy, reality behaves correctly. The version of events that should have happened, the recognition that was owed, the victory that was deserved, all of it plays out in perfect alignment with the false self's demands. The third cascade option, which often follows the first two or blends into them, is to attack others, devalue the source of supply. If someone is not giving enough or giving the wrong kind, or has somehow seen through the performance, they become a target, persecutory. The devaluation restores the hierarchy. The other person is diminished. The narcissist is elevated. The gap narrows for a moment until the critic fires again and the cycle resumes. What all three responses have in common is that they are defensive reactions to the same internal wound. They're not conscious choices, they are survival reflexes built into the architecture of the false self, and they all keep the false self in power while the true self stays buried and inaccessible. The critic is the jailer. The false self is the prison. And the true self is the prisoner who forgot they were ever a person with their own wants. If you're someone with narcissistic traits and you've tried therapy, you probably know how this goes. The therapist says something that lands close to real feedback. And instead of receiving it, you find yourself defending, justifying, or quietly explaining planning to fire them. You might have cycled through multiple therapists. You might have concluded that therapy does not work or that therapists are not smart enough to understand you. Here's what is happening underneath. The therapist becomes another potential source of shame. The therapeutic relationship, if it actually is working, requires vulnerability. It requires you to sit with being seen in an unflattering light, to hear feedback that does not match the version of yourself you prefer, to tolerate imperfection without compensating. For most people, that discomfort is bearable because their sense of self can tolerate imperfect feedback without collapsing. For the narcissist, the therapist's observations become corroborating evidence for the inner critic, another voice confirming what you already believe about yourself, another person who seems to know you are a fraud. Beckstein points out most therapies try to co-opt the narcissist's inflated ego and false self. They appeal to the narcissist's quest for perfection, brilliance, and eternal love. They suggest that if the narcissist just tried harder, performed better, became more disciplined, followed the program more carefully, they would feel better. This is contracting the false self. It reinforces the very structure that is causing the harm. The therapist becomes another audience for the performance rather than a witness to the person underneath. The therapy becomes another source of supply rather than a container for the wound. Real therapeutic progress would require the therapist to become a genuinely non-shaming presence, someone who can see the gap without using it as a weapon, someone who does not need the narcissist to perform in order to be valued, someone who can hold the true self underneath the false self without demanding the false self come down first. But that kind of consistent, non-reactive, non-shaming presence is rare, and it requires years of the right kind of relationship to create the conditions where the false self might actually relax. If the inner critic is at its core a judgment-generating machine, the principle from the book Oelani is most directly relevant here is non-judgmental acceptance, not as a self-help or positive thinking or another technique to feel better about yourself, but as a genuine structural alternative to the war you are running against your own internal experience. Non-judgmental acceptance applied inward means you stop adding punishment to pain. You feel the worthlessness without the added layer of self-flagellation. You notice the critic firing without automatically obeying its verdict. You hold your own experience, including the parts that do not match the godlike image, without the combat. The critic says you are nothing. You notice the critic said that. You do not agree or disagree. You just notice. In the book, we call it the ego person that's criticizing you as you go do things and turning them into your bitch. Read the chapter on the ego in the book OLNE. That noticing is the beginning of the separation between the false self and the true self. This is different from self-compassion that, as popular psychology describes, especially in YouTube. The critic is not asking you to love yourself, to affirm your worth, to repeat mantras about being deserving of love. That would just become another performance. Another thing that the false self can do perfectly and use as evidence of its own goodness, what the critic is asking for is harder than that. It is asking you to stop the combat, to let the feeling of being imperfect exist without calling in reinforcements of shame, to sit with the finite, flawed, ordinary human experience without the war. An important principle from the book is co-independence. Co-independence matters here very importantly in a specific way. The inner critic generates constant self-focused anxiety. Almost all of the narcissist's psychic energy goes toward managing the internal threat environment. It is nearly impossible to genuinely attend to another person's experience when your internal voice is a 24-hour loop of self-condemnation. Inner work is not separate from relational work. It is a prerequisite for it. You cannot coexist with another person genuinely wanting their well-being for their own sake when you are at war with your own. The capacity for genuine other regard requires a baseline of self-regard that the critic does not allow. Inner critic, quieted even partially, is the beginning of the capacity to actually love rather than just perform love, which is why in the book OLNE, it goes over the most important relationship you have is the relationship with yourself and the development you have with yourself. The inner critic keeps the false self in power, and the false self keeps you at a distance from anything real. Every deflection, every grandiosity burst, every retreat into fantasy is the false self protecting itself and its jailer from the exposure that would come from letting the true self be seen. Therapy that appeals to the false self will not work. It's like negotiating with the prison guard to free the prisoner. The guard has a job to do. Therapy that challenges the false self directly will trigger the critic. That is where most attempts at change stall. The architecture of narcissism is specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of self-confrontation. The next episode, episode 5, maps the therapy landscape: DBT, schema therapy, transference-focused psychotherapy, mentalization-based therapy, and cold therapy. What each actually does, what each one targets, which one addresses the sadistic superego directly, and why Vaknin believes none of them are sufficient on their own. Because changing the inner architecture of a personality disorder requires more than techniques. It requires a controlled shattering of the structure that has been holding the person together since childhood. I'll see you in the next episode. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.
I don't hide your name when I say my day. I keep every door open in the light. No secret rooms, no borrowed alibi. say. No smoke in the mirror, no debt to pay. We can know more than one kind of gold. Love don't get smaller when it's told. Open, open, I can love and understand. Open, open, no one knows my whole heartland. Say it clean, say it plain, no disguise, no hidden game. Open, open, that's the way I stand. You with your blue shirt at the corner table. Me with my lad and your soft boned face. I don't make a cage out of what we feel. I don't need a judge to make it real. If I need a say I need a road. If I stay all night, then you know I chose. Say what you mean what you say. No smoke in the mirror, no debt to pay. We can know more than one kind of gold. Love don't get smaller when it's told. Open, open, I can love and understand. Open, open, no one owns my whole heartland. Say it clean, say it plain, no disguise, no hidden game. Open, open, that's the way I stand. No escape hatch, no mask, just the truth on the table. No hierarchy to wear like a name tag label. I can choose with care, I can choose with grace. More than one bright fire in more than one place. Open, open, I can love, understand. Open,